He was a Navy SEAL, a man trained to make the hardest calls in the world. But this was an order he could barely give. His loyal partner of 12 years, Kaiser, was dying. A sudden, vicious cancer had ruptured inside him, and the vet, Dr. Sharma, had gently explained there was no hope. It was time to end his suffering. With a heart completely shattered, Cade knelt on the floor, pulling his best friend into his arms for one last embrace. "I'm sorry, buddy," he whispered, his voice breaking as he gave the vet the final, tearful nod. The needle was prepared. Cade squeezed his eyes shut, his hand resting on his dog's side. And then it happened. A sound so unexpected, so fierce, it froze the entire room. It was not a whimper of peace. It was a growl of pure, agonizing pain, and it exposed a terrible secret that would change everything. The town of Red Rock Creek, Ohio, wasn't a place you found by accident. It was a pocket of stillness carved out of the sprawling corn and soybean fields of the Midwest. Its town square, with a brick courthouse from a bygone era, was quiet even at midday. A damp chill, carrying the first real bite of late autumn, rolled in off the harvested fields, rattling the last stubborn leaves on the maple trees. It was a place where silence was the loudest sound, a place built for people to slow down, to heal, to be still. For Cade Rourke, it was agonizing. Cade, a man whose body was a finely tuned instrument of discipline and force, sat on the porch of his small rental farmhouse, his coffee going cold. He was tall, with the lean, dense build of a lifelong athlete and the sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was a Navy SEAL, currently on a rare, mandated shore leave. Back with his team, stillness meant you were in an ambush, a state of hypervigilance. Here, stillness just meant Tuesday. He felt coiled, a spring wound too tight, his energy thrumming under his skin with nowhere to go. The rustling wind felt like a whisper, and he was used to the roar of helicopter blades. He watched Mrs. Peterson, his neighbor 100 yards down the gravel road, check her mailbox. It was the third time that morning, the highlight of her day. Cade sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. He was grateful for the leave, he told himself. He needed it. The last deployment had been grueling, a blur of sand, salt water, and adrenaline. But the abrupt shift from 150 miles per hour to zero was giving him a unique kind of whiplash. He needed friction. He needed a challenge. A heavy head landed on his knee, accompanied by a low, contented groan. Cade looked down into the cloudy, intelligent eyes of Kaiser. Kaiser was a 12-year-old German shepherd, his muzzle a noble frost of gray and white, his thick coat fading but still imposing. He was Cade's retired MWD, his military working dog, the partner who had shared his cot, his rations, and the very air he breathed through 3 deployments. Kaiser had saved his life twice, once by finding an eye and once by simply existing when Cade thought he could not take another step. But the warrior of 6 years ago was now just an old dog. Kaiser rose stiffly from the porch, his back legs struggling for a moment against the crippling grip of arthritis. He took a few halting steps toward the edge of the porch, his limp more pronounced in the cold morning air. Cade's chest tightened. It was the one thing he could not fix, the one enemy he could not fight, time. Kaiser was a hero, a warrior trapped in a failing body. Cade looked at Kaiser and then he looked at the imposing rise of the tree line directly behind the farmhouse. It led to an old, abandoned limestone quarry. The locals called the high edge of it the quarry ledge, a steep, treacherous incline of loose rock and jagged stone that challenged even experienced hikers. Cade had been avoiding it, respecting the rest part of his leave. But today, the restlessness was too much. The ledge was a problem to be solved. He stood up, the sudden movement decisive. "I can't just sit here," he said, more to himself than to the dog. He needed to burn off the agitation. He needed to sweat, to feel his lungs burn, to remind himself he was still sharp. He decided on a run, a hard one. He went inside to pull on his running shoes. When he emerged, Kaiser was standing by the door, his tail giving a hopeful, thumping wag. Despite his stiff legs, the old dog knew the signs, the shoes, the determined set of Cade's jaw. It meant a mission. Kaiser let out a low, eager whine. Cade stopped, his hand on the doorknob. He looked at Kaiser's expectant face, then at his trembling back legs. "Not this time, buddy," Cade said softly. "This one's," he paused. He knew Kaiser was in pain. The veterinarian had been clear, short, gentle walks on flat ground only. But then Cade looked into Kaiser's eyes. The spark was still there. That fierce, unwavering loyalty, the need to be by his side, to have a job. A part of Cade, the SEAL part, the part that despised weakness, wrestled with his common sense. He hated seeing Kaiser like this, reduced to an invalid. Pain is weakness leaving the body. The old saying echoed in his head. It was a cruel philosophy, one he lived by. He looked at the ledge, then back at the dog. Maybe a real challenge was what Kaiser needed. Not coddling, a little work to keep him sharp. You think you still got it in you, old man? Cade asked, his voice rough. Kaiser responded with another whine, stepping forward eagerly, ignoring the protest of his own hips. Cade made a decision. It was the flaw of a man who believed willpower could conquer anything. He mistook Kaiser's loyalty for strength. All right, Cade said, grabbing the leash he knew he wouldn't even use. A little exercise will do you good. Let's go. The first 100 yards through the field were fine. But then the path steepened, and the real climb began. The terrain turned to loose rock and sharp inclines. Cade, in his element, moved like a deer, his feet finding purchase, his powerful legs driving him upward. He was breathing hard, the cold air stinging his lungs, and he felt alive. Come on, Kaiser. Up, he called back. Kaiser was struggling. He was 20 yards behind, his breathing already a harsh, rasping pant. His stiff legs scrambled on the loose gravel, and he slipped, his front paws buckling for a moment. But he recovered, his eyes fixed on Cade, and continued to climb. He would not fail his handler. He would not be left behind. Good boy. That's it. Cade encouraged, his voice the same commanding tone he used in training drills. He felt a surge of pride. Kaiser still had the fire. He was wrong to doubt him. They climbed higher, the wind whipping at them, the town of Red Rock Creek shrinking to a toy village below. Cade was pushing himself, and in doing so, he was pushing Kaiser far past his limits. The dog was running on pure adrenaline and loyalty, his joints screaming in protest, but he never made a sound. They reached a small clearing at the summit, a flat shelf of rock overlooking the abandoned quarry. Cade stopped, hands on his hips, breathing deeply. He felt purged, the nervous energy finally burned away. Kaiser staggered up behind him, his entire body trembling with exhaustion, his tongue lolling out, covered in dirt. But he was there. He had made it. I knew you had it in you, Cade said, giving the dog a rough pat on the head. He felt that familiar bond, the pride of a commander in his soldier. Kaiser had passed the test. Cade looked around, exhilarated. His eyes landed on a perfect, sturdy stick near his feet. In that moment of adrenaline-fueled pride, he wanted one more test, one more flash of the old days. He looked over the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a cliff, but a steep, rocky ravine, a 40-foot drop of loose scree and treacherous boulders. A stupid, dangerous place. He picked up the stick. Kaiser's eyes immediately locked onto it, his body tensing, ready for the command. All right, one last one, Cade said, grinning. Go get it, Kaiser. Bring it back. He hurled the stick with all his strength, sending it sailing down into the heart of the rocky ravine. For Kaiser, it was not a suggestion. It was a command. His handler had given him a mission. The 12-year-old dog, running on a heart that would not quit and bones that had already given up, summoned the last of his warrior spirit. He launched himself off the ledge. It was not the powerful leap of his youth. It was a desperate, clumsy jump. His front paws hit the loose scree, and his back legs, stiff with arthritis and exhausted from the climb, failed him completely. They buckled. Cade's grin vanished. Kaiser didn't just stumble. He fell. He tumbled head over heels, his body hitting the jagged rocks, rolling, gaining speed. Cade heard a sound he would never forget, a sharp, agonizing yelp of pain that cut through the wind. Kaiser's tumble was finally stopped by a large boulder at the bottom of the ravine. He lay still, a broken shape on the gray stones. The silence that followed was absolute. Cade stood frozen on the ledge, the wind whipping his jacket, his ears ringing with the echo of that terrible sound. For a full second, Cade Rourke stood paralyzed on the ledge, the sound of Kaiser's pained yelp echoing off the rocks, seemingly louder than the wind. The world went silent, just as it did in the moments before an explosion. He was a man trained to react, to compress panic into instant, violent action. He did not shout again. He moved. He didn't climb down the ravine, he descended it. A controlled fall. His boots slid on the loose scree, his body angled, using the momentum rather than fighting it. He was a SEAL, and this was just another obstacle, he told himself. But his heart was hammering against his ribs, not with adrenaline, but with a cold, sickening dread. He reached the bottom in seconds, his boots landing hard beside the still form of his dog. Kaiser, talk to me. Kaiser was lying on his side, his breathing shallow and fast. His eyes were wide, glazed with shock. Cade's hands, the same hands that could field strip a rifle in the dark, fumbled as they ran over the dog's body. He checked the legs, the ribs, the spine, expecting to feel the wet warmth of blood or the unnatural angle of a broken bone. He found nothing. No blood, no obvious break. "Kaiser," he said again, his voice sharper this time, the voice of a handler. At the command, a flicker of that old training sparked in Kaiser's eyes. The dog let out a low whine, his thick plume of gray fur gave a single weak thump against the stones. Then, to Cade's utter disbelief, Kaiser began to move. He groaned, planting his front paws, and with a trembling, agonizing effort, pushed himself upright. He stood on 4 legs, swaying, his head low. He looked at Cade and thumped his tail again, harder this time, as if to say, "See? I'm okay. Mission complete." The tension in Cade's chest, a vice grip of fear, snapped. It was replaced by a hot, sudden, and completely irrational surge of anger. "What was that?" he snapped, his voice sharp. "You have to be more careful than that." He wasn't yelling at the dog. He was yelling at the image of the fall, at the sound of the yelp, at his own breathtaking stupidity. He was furious with himself, and the only target for that shame was the dog who had just tried to please him. Kaiser just looked at him, panting, his body trembling. The anger vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the heavy, cold reality of the situation. "Come on, old man," Cade said, his voice softening. "Let's go home." Kaiser took a step and nearly collapsed. His limp wasn't just a limp. He was barely putting weight on his entire back half. The climb up had been a challenge. The climb down was an impossibility. Cade sighed, the sound lost in the wind. He knelt. "All right, buddy. Just like old times." He positioned himself next to the dog, sliding one arm under Kaiser's chest and the other under his hips. With a practiced grunt, he lifted all 90 pounds of his partner. Kaiser, who hated being carried, leaned his head against Cade's chest in weary acceptance. The walk down from the quarry was a slow, agonizing penance. Cade's arms, conditioned for any test, began to burn under the steady, awkward weight. Kaiser was a dead weight, his body limp. Several times Cade had to stop, readjusting his grip, his own legs shaking from the strain of the descent on the loose rock. He didn't mind the pain. He deserved it. He had done this. He had broken the one thing in the world that trusted him absolutely. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, cold shadows across the fields. Cade gently lowered Kaiser onto the thick, braided rug in front of the fireplace. The dog immediately curled up, his back to the room, and let out a long, shuddering sigh before falling into a deep, twitching sleep. Cade watched him, his guilt a physical weight. He checked the dog again, more thoroughly this time. He ran his fingers through the thick fur, pressing along the hips, the legs, the spine. Kaiser flinched and whimpered in his sleep when Cade pressed on his right hip, but there was still no blood, no obvious swelling. He must have just bruised it, Cade rationalized, clinging to the hope. A bad bruise or a sprain. He's tough. He'll sleep it off. That evening, the farmhouse was suffocatingly quiet. Cade opened a can of premium dog food, the expensive kind Kaiser loved. The sound of the electric can opener usually brought the shepherd running. Tonight, there was nothing. Cade put the bowl down on the floor. "Kaiser, chow time." Kaiser lifted his head, looked at the bowl, and then with a sigh laid his head back down on his paws. He didn't even try to stand. Cade's stomach tightened. Kaiser had never, not once in 12 years, skipped a meal. But the denial was stronger than the fear. "He's just sore," Cade told himself. "He's exhausted from the climb. I wouldn't want to eat either." He sat in his armchair, a book open on his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was listening. He was monitoring the situation. He timed Kaiser's breathing. He watched the slight involuntary shiver that ran through the dog's flanks. His mind raced. He thought about calling the local veterinarian, Dr. Anya Sharma. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had seen Kaiser for his arthritis. Cade could almost hear her voice from their last visit. "He's an old dog, Mr. Rourke. He's earned his retirement. Gentle, short walks on flat ground only." A hot flush of shame washed over Cade. What would he say? "Hi, Dr. Sharma, I know you said gentle walks, so I decided to make him run up a rocky ledge and then jump into a ravine." He closed his eyes. No, he wouldn't call. He wouldn't be the overreacting rookie. It was a sprain. He would monitor, just as he'd been trained. He went to the medicine cabinet and found the bottle of pain medication prescribed for Kaiser's arthritis. He read the label, 1 tablet, twice daily as needed for pain. He shook one pill into his hand, hesitated, and then put it back. He pulled out the whole pill, broke it in half, and then took the original half, a standard dose. He coated it in peanut butter. Kaiser ate the treat from his hand, his tail wagging weakly, and Cade felt a small sliver of relief. He was taking action. He was managing the problem. He went to bed late, but he didn't sleep. He lay in the darkness, every sense on high alert, listening to the sound of his dog breathing by the dying fire. He must have drifted off, because the sound that woke him was disorienting. It wasn't loud. It was a soft, shuffling, dragging sound. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Cade was out of bed in an instant, his heart pounding a cold, heavy rhythm. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough of a faint red glow to see shapes. Kaiser was not on his rug. Cade's eyes swept the room and found him. Kaiser was halfway to the farmhouse door where his water bowl was. He was not walking. He was pulling his entire body forward with his front legs, his back legs dragging uselessly behind him, limp and unresponsive. Cade hit the lights. Kaiser stopped, panting heavily, his sides heaving. He turned his head and looked at Cade. The look in his dog's eyes shattered Cade's denial into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't just pain. It was confusion. It was the bewildered, terrified look of a soldier betrayed by his own body. It was the look of an animal asking a question his handler could not answer. Cade stared at the two useless legs, at the path they dragged through the dust on the floor. This was not a sprain. This was not a bruise. This was something horribly, catastrophically wrong. The sight of Kaiser's useless legs sent a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline through Cade. The denial evaporated, replaced by the focused, narrow-vision calm of mission mode. This was no longer a vague illness. This was a casualty. He didn't waste a second. He grabbed the thick wool blanket from the back of his sofa, wrapping it around Kaiser's trembling body, creating a stabilization wrap, a taco just as he'd been taught for human casualties. He slid his arms under the makeshift stretcher, his mind automatically calculating the weight and balance. He lifted the 90-pound dog as if he weighed nothing, his movements economical and swift. "Hold on, buddy," Cade whispered, his voice a low, steady command. "I'm getting you out." He kicked the farmhouse door open and moved into the biting cold of the Ohio night. The truck, his old reliable Ford, started on the first try. He laid Kaiser on the passenger seat, the dog's body limp, his breathing shallow. Kaiser let out a low, pained whine, the only sound in the cab besides the roar of the engine. Cade drove, not like a panicked civilian, but like a man on a high-threat extraction. His hands were steady at 10 and 2, his eyes scanning the dark, empty road, processing the minimal light, the distance, the time. Red Rock Creek was asleep. The streetlights cast isolated pools of yellow on the empty pavement. His mind was a flurry of tactical assessments, running through a checklist of possibilities: a stroke, a spinal injury, a pinched nerve. His mind actively, powerfully rejected the one scenario he had witnessed. The fall. The fall was his fault. This paralysis, this sudden collapse, it had to be something else. It had to be a cruel twist of fate, a sudden betrayal of old age. The human mind, even one as disciplined as Cade's, is a master of self-preservation. And right now, Cade's psyche could not accept that he had broken his own dog. He skidded to a halt on the gravel outside the Red Rock Creek Veterinary Clinic. The building was dark, save for a single small sign glowing over the door: emergency. He left the truck running, headlights cutting through the darkness, and carried Kaiser to the door. He pressed the buzzer, his thumb holding it down with relentless pressure. A moment later, the door was unlocked by a woman who was the very definition of weary competence. This was Dr. Anya Sharma. She was a woman in her late 50s, her dark hair pulled back in a functional, messy bun. She wore green scrubs under a thick flannel bathrobe, her sharp, intelligent eyes instantly assessing the situation. "On the table in the back," she said, her voice rough from sleep, but instantly authoritative. Cade moved past her, his boots echoing in the sterile silence of the clinic. The smell of disinfectant and old coffee hung in the air. He placed Kaiser on the cold stainless steel examination table. "What happened?" Dr. Sharma asked, pushing her glasses up as she pulled on a pair of latex gloves. Her hands were on Kaiser, her fingers moving with practiced skill, checking his vitals, his spine. This was the moment for the after-action report, for the truth. Cade opened his mouth. The words, "We were on the quarry ledge and he took a fall," were on the tip of his tongue. But they died. He looked at Dr. Sharma's professional face, and all he felt was a hot, suffocating wave of shame. He was a Navy SEAL. He was supposed to be a protector, a handler. Admitting he had recklessly endangered his own partner felt like a betrayal of his entire identity. It sounded like negligence. It sounded like an excuse. "I don't know," Cade said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "It's his arthritis. It just got really bad all of a sudden. He was fine this afternoon, just stiff. Tonight he couldn't stand up." He dragged himself to the door. It was a lie by omission, a carefully curated truth that painted a picture of tragic, sudden old age. Dr. Sharma looked at him for a second, her gaze searching, but she didn't question his report. She was focused on the patient. "He's in shock," she said. She lifted Kaiser's lip. "His gums are white, white as snow." She pressed a finger into the pale tissue. "No capillary refill. He's not circulating blood." Her hands moved to Kaiser's abdomen, her fingers pressing gently, systematically. Kaiser, in his pained, weak state, didn't even flinch. "His belly is distended," she murmured, more to herself. "It's tight, like a drum." She looked at Cade, her face grim. "He's bleeding, Cade. Somewhere inside. I need to run a blood panel now." She moved with an efficiency that Cade respected. She clipped a small patch of fur, drew a vial of dark blood, and slotted it into the in-house diagnostic machine. The machine began to whir, a mechanical sound that filled the heavy silence. Cade stood by the head of the table, his hand on Kaiser's neck, a useless, trembling anchor. He was no longer a SEAL. He was just a man in a room, completely stripped of his power, waiting for a machine to deliver a verdict. The machine beeped. Dr. Sharma walked over to the small screen, her back to Cade. She was silent for a long time. When she finally turned around, her professional demeanor had softened. Her face was etched with a deep, profound, and all too familiar sadness. She looked at him not as a doctor to a client, but as one human being to another. "Cade," she began, her voice gentle. "His blood count is catastrophic. He's severely anemic. He's lost a significant amount of blood into his own body." Cade's throat was tight. From the arthritis?" he managed to ask, clinging to the lie, desperately needing it to be true. Dr. Sharma shook her head slowly. "No, sweetheart, not from arthritis." She took a deep breath. "Kaiser is a 12-year-old German Shepherd. The symptoms, the sudden collapse, the pale gums, the paralysis in the back legs, this massive spontaneous internal bleeding, it is the absolute textbook presentation for a condition called hemangiosarcoma." Cade stared, the words sounding like static. "Cancer. A very aggressive, very common cancer of the blood vessels," she confirmed, her voice cracking slightly. "It grows silently, most often on the spleen. They grow and the dog seems perfectly fine. Then, with no warning, one of the tumors bursts, just like this. It causes catastrophic, untreatable bleeding. It explains everything. The weakness, the collapse, the pale gums." Cade felt the floor drop out from under him. Cancer, an invisible enemy that had been growing inside his friend all along. It was a worse, more insidious betrayal than he could have imagined. This is why he collapsed," Dr. Sharma continued, her voice full of pity. "There's no trauma, no external cause. It just happens. His body is shutting down. Cade, I am so sorry." The doctor's words, meant to be a comfort, were a dagger. No trauma. Her diagnosis, based on the incomplete facts he had given her, had just handed him a perfect, terrible alibi. His lie was now the official truth. He had not failed his dog. A silent, vicious disease had. But as Cade looked at the dying dog on the table, a new, even colder wave of guilt washed over him. He thought of the run up the ledge. He thought of the jump, the fall. Had the stress, caused the tumor to burst? He had wanted to push his partner. He had. And now, in the most horrific way imaginable, he had gotten his wish. He had pushed Kaiser over the edge. The word cancer hung in the sterile air of the exam room. An enemy Cade couldn't flank, couldn't fight. It was an insidious, invisible foe, and it had taken his partner. He stared at Dr. Sharma, his mind struggling to process the information, trying to fit it into a tactical framework, but there was none. Dr. Sharma, her face a mask of gentle professionalism, broke the silence. "Cade, we can try surgery. We can try to remove the spleen, but I need you to understand. With hemangiosarcoma, by the time it bleeds, it is almost certainly metastasized. It's likely in his lungs, his heart. The surgery itself is incredibly high risk, and it might only buy him a few more days, maybe a week. And those days will be hard, filled with pain." She let the words sink in, a clinical assessment of a battle already lost. The bleeding won't stop. We can't save him. Cade felt the last of his SEAL discipline crack. This wasn't a mission. It was a surrender. So, what are you saying? He whispered, his voice sounding hollow, unrecognizable to himself. I'm saying the most humane, the kindest thing we can do for him, Dr. Sharma said, her eyes welling with a sympathy that was genuine and deep, is to let him go. To end the pain, to let him pass with dignity while he's in your arms. Dignity. The word was a punch. What dignity was there in this? What dignity had Cade afforded him on that ledge? Cade looked down at Kaiser, who was lying limply on the steel table, his body covered in a blanket. The dog had given him everything, his youth, his strength, his loyalty. And Cade, in his restlessness, his stupid, selfish pride, had demanded more. He had pushed Kaiser up that ledge, demanded he make that jump. He was convinced in that sickening moment that the stress of the fall, the traumatic impact, was what had caused the tumor to rupture. He had been the one to pull the pin. Cade couldn't form the words. Dr. Sharma nodded, understanding the silence. You don't have to decide this second. Let's get him off this cold table. We have a room. It's quieter. I'll have my assistant bring him in. You take your time. She slipped out of the room, leaving Cade alone in the harsh fluorescent light, his ears ringing. A few minutes later, a young veterinary technician, a kind-faced girl in her 20s with sad eyes, entered. She didn't speak. She just helped Cade move Kaiser, still wrapped in his blanket, onto a small rolling gurney. The technician, whose name tag read Jenna, led him down a short hallway to a room at the very end. It was nothing like the rest of the clinic. The lights were dim, the walls painted a soft, calming green. There was no steel, only a comfortable cushioned sofa and a thick, soft rug on the floor. It was a room designed for goodbyes. Jenna helped him lay Kaiser on the rug, then placed a fresh bowl of water on the floor, a gesture of hopeless optimism, and left, closing the door softly behind her. The silence that fell was absolute, broken only by Kaiser's shallow, ragged breathing. Cade sat on the floor, pulling Kaiser's heavy head into his lap. He stroked the dog's fur, his hand trembling. I'm sorry, buddy, he whispered, the words thick, choking him. I'm so sorry. He sat there for an hour, or maybe it was a lifetime. The walls of the small room seemed to dissolve, and he was no longer in Red Rock Creek, Ohio. He was back. Back in the cold, thin air of the Hindu Kush Mountains. They had been on a 3-day patrol, tracking a high-value target. The team was exhausted, depleted, their oxygen levels low, their muscles screaming. Kaiser was limping, his paws raw and bleeding from the frozen, jagged rock. They had finally reached the target compound, a small, mud-walled structure. The team's orders were to clear it. Cade, as the handler, was supposed to send Kaiser in first to check for explosives. He looked at Kaiser. The dog was trembling, not from fear, but from sheer, bone-crushing exhaustion. He whimpered softly, licking his bleeding paw. He's done, Cage, the medic whispered. He's at his limit. Cade knew it. He knew Kaiser was spent, but he also knew the protocol. He knew what was inside that building was more dangerous than a tired dog. He knelt, pressing his forehead against Kaiser's. I know, buddy. I know you're tired, but I need you. One last job. I need you to go to work. He unclipped the leash. Go on, he commanded. Find it. And Kaiser, with that same unbreakable loyalty, had stood. He had limped through that doorway, his body shaking, and he had done his job. He found the pressure plate-eyed, saving the lives of at least 3 team members. Cade had felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost knocked him over. He had pushed his partner to the absolute limit, and Kaiser had delivered. Now, sitting in the quiet room, Cade was struck by the horrific parallel. On that mountain, he had pushed Kaiser past his limits to save lives. Today, on the quarry ledge, he had done the exact same thing. For what? For a stick? For his own selfish need to see the fire in his old partner, he had pushed Kaiser past his limits, not for the mission, but for his own ego. And this time, he hadn't saved lives. He had taken one. The cancer had been the enemy waiting in the dark, but Cade had been the one to set it off. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his guilt, his command responsibility, crushing him. He was a SEAL. He was trained to make the hard calls. He was trained to know when a mission was compromised, when a fight was unwinnable. He knew that leaving a man, or a partner, to suffer was the greatest failure of all. Kaiser whined in his sleep, a low, pained sound. His body was hot, his breathing getting shallower. The bleeding was accelerating. He was in pain. Cade's decision solidified, hardening from grief into a cold, dreadful resolve. He had pushed Kaiser into this fight. He would be the one to end his suffering. It was the only act of mercy he had left. He slowly, carefully laid Kaiser's head down on the rug. He stood up on shaking legs and opened the door. Dr. Sharma was at the front desk, as if she had been waiting. She looked up, her face full of a question she didn't need to ask. Cade's eyes were red, but his voice was steady. It was the voice of a commander, a man making the final, hardest call. "I can't let him suffer," he said, his voice a rasp. "I won't. It's time." Dr. Sharma nodded, a single, sad acknowledgement. I'll go prepare," she said softly. Cade walked back into the room and closed the door. He knelt on the floor, one hand on Kaiser's chest, and waited for the sound of her footsteps. The silence in the small green room was a living thing, heavy, oppressive, and final. Cade knelt on the soft rug, his hand resting on Kaiser's flank, feeling the shallow, unsteady rise and fall of his breathing. He was no longer a SEAL on a high-stakes mission. He was just a man, hollowed out by grief, waiting for an execution he had ordered. The door opened with a sound so soft it was almost an apology. Cade looked up. Dr. Anya Sharma stood in the doorway, her face etched with a pained, professional sympathy. In her hand, she held a single, small syringe. The liquid inside was a bright, almost cheerful pink. It was a color that promised peace, a gentle end to the pain, but to Cade, it looked like a betrayal. "Cade," she said softly, stepping into the room. Are you ready?" He couldn't speak. The words no and yes were fighting a war in his throat, and both felt like a lie. He looked down at Kaiser, who was stirring weakly, his eyes unfocused, a low, almost imperceptible moan escaping his lips. The cancer was eating him alive. The bleeding was accelerating. This was not a life. It was a slow, agonizing departure. Cade looked back at the doctor and gave a single, sharp nod. "All right," she said, her voice catching for just a moment before her training took over. "Let's make him comfortable." She knelt on the floor opposite Cade, placing the syringe on a small sterile pad. She had a small electric clipper in her pocket. "I just need to shave a little patch on his leg," she explained, her voice a low, clinical murmur. "It helps me find the vein. It won't hurt him, I promise." The small buzzing sound of the clippers filled the room, an absurdly normal noise in a moment of profound tragedy. Cade shielded Kaiser's head, turning the dog's face toward his own chest as if he could protect him from this final indignity. "Shh, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Sharma worked quickly, her hands sure and practiced. She swabbed the small, bare patch of skin with an alcohol wipe, the sharp, cold smell cutting through the air. She gently applied pressure, and the small, delicate vein presented itself. She picked up the pink syringe. "Okay, Cade," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's time. He'll just feel a little pinch. He'll be asleep in seconds. He won't feel any more pain." The finality of it hit Cade like a physical blow. The tears he had been holding back finally came, hot and silent. He bent his head down until his forehead was pressed against Kaiser's. He had to say the words. He owed him the truth. "I'm sorry, Kaiser," he choked out, the words torn from his chest. "I'm so sorry. I did this. I pushed you. I was stupid, and my pride, it hurt you." He was confessing not to the fall, but to what he believed was the greater crime, pushing his friend so hard that the cancer, the silent killer, had finally burst. "I'm sorry, buddy. I was wrong. Your watch is over. You can rest now." He felt a profound, animalistic need to hold his partner one last time. He placed one hand on Kaiser's chest, feeling the weak, thready thump-thump of his failing heart. His other hand, acting on its own memory, moved instinctively to Kaiser's right hip, the side he had hit, the side he had been pressing in his sleep. It was a gesture of protection, of guilt, of a handler trying to shield the wound. Dr. Sharma positioned the needle. "Goodbye, sweet boy," she whispered. She began to apply pressure. Cade squeezed his eyes shut, his grip on his dog tightening in a final, agonizing embrace. His hand on the hip, the hand that knew the guilt, clenched. Growl. The sound was not a whimper. It was not a sigh. It was a deep, thoracic, agonizing roar of pure, unadulterated pain. It ripped through the quiet room, a sound of such sudden, violent life that it was shocking. Dr. Sharma's hand jerked back, the needle pulling free, a tiny drop of pink solution splashing on her glove. She stared at Kaiser, her face pale with shock. "What?" Cade's eyes snapped open, his heart hammering. "Kaiser, who seconds before had been limp, was now rigid, his lip curled, his head trying to turn toward Cade's hand. The dog was trembling, not with weakness, but with fury. "Wait," Cade yelled, his voice a sharp command that startled even himself. His hand was still on Kaiser's hip. He hadn't moved it. He must have had a muscle spasm, Dr. Sharma stammered, her composure rattled. "Cade, it's just a reflex." "No," Cade said, his mind racing, connecting dots with the speed of a battlefield assessment. He looked at his hand, then at the dog. "Wait." He did it again. He pressed his fingers, just lightly, into the exact same spot on Kaiser's hip. The reaction was immediate and even more violent. Kaiser snapped, his teeth clicking, a flash of his old warrior self. It was a clear, unambiguous, "Do not touch me there." Cade stared at Dr. Sharma, his eyes wide. "He's in pain," he said, the words bursting out of him. "Anya, he's reacting. He's reacting to that spot." Dr. Sharma was frozen, the syringe held uselessly in her hand. She stared at the dog, then at Cade, her medical mind processing the new data, warring with the diagnosis she had just delivered. "He shouldn't be able to do that," she whispered, more to herself than to Cade. "What do you mean?" Cade demanded. A dog dying of systemic, metastatic hemangiosarcoma, "They're too weak," she said, her voice gaining a sharp, analytical edge. "They're in a state of shock, shutting down. They don't have that kind of specific, acute pain response. They don't have the energy. They don't have the life to be that angry." She looked at the spot on Kaiser's hip, then back at Cade, her eyes suddenly sharp with a new, terrifying light. "Cade," she said, her voice low and urgent. "That is not the reflex of a dog dying of cancer. That is the reflex of an acute trauma." The room, which seconds before had been saturated with a heavy, final grief, was instantly electrified. The air was no longer still, it was thin and sharp. Dr. Anya Sharma stared at the spot where Cade's hand had been, then at Kaiser's curled lip. She didn't just lower the pink syringe, she recoiled from it, throwing it onto the small counter as if it were contaminated. It clattered against a metal tray, its purpose, its poison, instantly rejected. "On the floor now," she commanded, her voice stripped of all its soft, sympathetic edges. It was the voice of an emergency room doctor, sharp, fast, and absolute. Cade, his own mind reeling from the impossible hope, reacted instantly. "What are we doing?" "We're getting the truth," she said. She grabbed the electric clippers from her pocket, the same ones she had used for the fourth. "Hold his head and hold him still. This is going to hurt him, and I don't care." Cade moved, his own body flooded with a new, terrifying kind of adrenaline. This wasn't the slow poison of grief. It was the electric shock of a desperate, last-minute rescue. He put one arm over Kaiser's neck, holding his head firmly against the rug. "I've got him," he said, his voice a low growl. "Easy, buddy. I've got you." The high-pitched buzz of the clippers filled the small room. Dr. Sharma was not gentle this time. She pressed the clippers firmly against the dog's right hip, the spot that had triggered the reaction, and began to carve a long, wide path through the thick gray and black fur. At first, there was only pale skin, shockingly white, beneath the dark coat. Kaiser whimpered and tensed, but Cade held him fast. Dr. Sharma moved the clippers again, widening the patch, then again, moving down his flank toward his abdomen. And then they both saw it. Cade let out a small, choked sound. It wasn't a bruise. It was a catastrophe. It was a terrifying, subcutaneous map of the fall. A violent, hidden hemorrhage spreading from his hip across his entire flank and disappearing under his belly. It was a sickening, deep purple black surrounded by an angry red and yellow. It was the precise, undeniable signature of a massive blunt force trauma. Dr. Sharma stared at it, her gloved hand hovering over the wound, her mind visibly processing a decade of veterinary medicine. "My goodness," she whispered. The sight was so horrific, so violent that it silenced even her. She finally lifted her gaze from the ruined skin and locked eyes with Cade. Her face was pale, and her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but as sharp and penetrating as a scalpel. "Cade, what happened to this dog?" The lie, the flimsy, self-serving story of arthritis, dissolved. It felt stupid and childish in the face of the evidence. There was no hiding. There was no alibi. The proof of his recklessness was right there, tattooed on his partner's skin. He couldn't meet her eyes. He looked down at the floor, the shame so hot it felt like it was scorching his face. We were on the ledge," he whispered, the confession tearing out of him, ragged and raw. "This morning. The quarry ledge. I was restless. I made him run. He confessed it all: the climb, the arrogance, the stupid, pointless stick, the jump. He fell, Cade's voice cracked, and he had to stop, taking a shuddering breath. He fell onto the rocks. He tumbled. I carried him down. I thought he was just bruised. I thought it was just a sprain. He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. He stood up. He wagged his tail. I swear, I didn't know. You didn't know? Dr. Sharma repeated, her voice flat. Then she exploded. She shot to her feet, her own body vibrating with a sudden, furious energy. He's bleeding to death, Cade. He's not bruised. That fall ruptured his spleen. She was pacing now, a lion in the small room, her mind recalculating everything. The symptoms, they're identical, she said, thinking aloud, connecting the dots with horrifying speed. Sudden collapse, pale gums, internal bleeding, hind leg weakness from the anemia. I saw it all, and I assumed the most common diagnosis, hemangiosarcoma. She stopped pacing and pointed a shaking finger at Cade. You lied to me. You omitted the facts. You came in here with a story about arthritis. You let me believe this was a tragedy. But this, she pointed at the bruise, this changes everything. Cade stared, his mind fogged with guilt. So he is dying? Yes. She shouted, but for the wrong reason. She took a step toward him, her eyes blazing with an almost manic, terrifying hope. Don't you understand? She said, her voice dropping, becoming low and intense. This is not a death sentence. It's a plumbing problem. Cade, his mind still trapped in the fog of cancer and grief, couldn't follow. What? This isn't cancer, Cade, she said, grabbing his arm. This is trauma. We are not fighting an unbeatable metastatic war that we've already lost. We are fighting a wound, a single, catastrophic leak. And a wound can be fixed. The hope that bloomed in Cade's chest was so sudden and so fierce it was physically painful. He staggered, his mind trying to catch up. Kaiser wasn't dying of an invisible, insidious disease. He was dying from an injury. And then the hope was immediately extinguished by a wave of nausea so profound that Cade nearly gagged. The fall hadn't been the worst part. His lie had. His shame, his inability to admit his own catastrophic failure as a handler, had sent Dr. Sharma down the wrong path. His lie had obscured the truth, and that lie had led them here, to this soft green room with a pink syringe full of poison. He had almost euthanized his own partner, not because of the fall, but because he was too much of a coward to tell the truth. Dr. Sharma saw the realization dawn on his face, the self-hatred. She had no time for it. I don't have time for your guilt right now, soldier. We have one chance, and it's closing. She was already at the door, ripping it open. The small clinic, which had been dark and silent, was now a flurry of motion. The young technician, Jenna, who had been dozing at the front desk, shot upright. Doctor? Jenna asked, her voice high with alarm. Get the surgical suite prepped now. Dr. Sharma commanded, her voice echoing in the hallway. Turn on the gas. Get the monitors. Pull a full splenectomy pack. I want 2 units of FFP, fresh frozen plasma, thawing in the water bath yesterday. Go. Go. Jenna, a trained professional, didn't hesitate. She sprinted to the back. Dr. Sharma turned to Cade. She was no longer a sympathetic civilian. She was a field general. She grabbed the gurney that Kaiser had been rolled in on. He's crashing, Cade. The bleeding is accelerating. We have to move him now. She locked eyes with him, her gaze hard as steel. You caused this wound. Now, you're going to help me save his life. The small, green-walled room was a scene of controlled chaos. The moment Dr. Sharma yelled, "Go!" Cade was already moving. He scooped Kaiser up, not in the gentle blanket wrap of a mourner, but in the firm, tactical carry of an evacuation. Kaiser was a dead weight, his body limp and cold to the touch. They burst through the double doors back into the bright, sterile hallway. The clinic, which had been a tomb of grief, was now a high-stakes emergency room. Jenna, the young technician, was a blur of motion, her face pale but focused. She was already in the surgical suite, a room of gleaming steel and blue drapes, tearing open sterilized packs. On the table. Dr. Sharma commanded. Cade laid Kaiser on the cold steel table. The dog's body splayed, his breathing terrifyingly shallow. A single, rattling gasp. He's crashing, Dr. Sharma said, her voice sharp. We need a line, Jenna. A large bore, 18 gauge, now. And I need plasma. Jenna was already there, clippers in hand, shaving a patch on Kaiser's front leg. Hold him, Cade. Hold him down. She yelled. Cade, his mind finally having a mission, pinned his partner. He pressed his weight onto Kaiser's shoulders, his hand gripping the leg. Jenna was fast, swabbing the skin and then, with expert precision, sinking the catheter. A dark, shockingly thick bloom of blood welled up, spilling over Jenna's glove and onto Cade's hands. It was the first time Cade had seen his partner's blood today, and it was his fault. Jenna attached the fluid line, and the first drops of life-saving saline began to flow. He's intubated, Dr. Sharma said from the dog's head, taping a breathing tube in place. A vital signs monitor flared to life, emitting a slow, agonizingly weak beep. Beep, beep, beep. Cade was still holding the leg, his hand smeared with the dark, sticky blood. He was in the zone, a SEAL on a mission, his focus absolute. He was ready for the next command. It was not the one he expected. Dr. Sharma looked up. Her dark eyes, visible above her surgical mask, were hard as ice. Get out. Cade blinked. What? I can. No, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. You are not a handler in here. You are not a SEAL. You are a civilian. You are in my way, and you are compromised. Go to the waiting room now. I will not have you in my O.R. It was a dismissal so total, so absolute, it cut through his tactical fog. He was being ejected from the battle. He was, as she said, compromised. He looked at his partner, now a mess of tubes and wires, vanishing under a blue sterile drape. Go, Dr. Sharma ordered. Cade let go of the leg. He felt utterly, profoundly useless. He stumbled backward out of the surgical suite, his hands held awkwardly in front of him. Jenna hit the button to swing the door shut, and it closed with a soft, pneumatic hiss, sealing him off from the fight. He was in the hallway. It was silent. He walked, his steps wooden, back to the main waiting room. The cheerful art on the walls, pictures of smiling puppies and kittens, felt like a mockery. He collapsed into one of the hard, unforgiving plastic chairs, the same ones he'd seen in field hospitals. The adrenaline, the brief, beautiful surge of action, drained away, leaving a toxic, hollow residue. The clinic was silent, save for the low hum of the ventilation and the distant, muffled sounds of a desperate battle being waged behind a closed door. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in Kaiser's blood. It was smeared on his palms, caked under his fingernails, a dark, damning stain. He stared at it, his breathing shallow. He, Cade Rourke, was a man trained to protect, to shield, to be the force protection for his team. His entire life was built on a code of vigilance, and he had failed. He sat there as the clock on the wall ticked. 12:30 a.m., 1:00 a.m. He replayed the day, the week, his entire leave, the restlessness, the boredom, the arrogance. He had been so desperate to feel like a SEAL that he had treated his retired, arthritic partner like a recruit in training. He saw the first wound, the one he had caused on the ledge. The stupid stick, the prideful command, the terrible, bone-jarring fall. He had physically broken his dog with his own ego. But the horror did not stop there. A deeper, more sickening wave of guilt washed over him. He saw the second wound, the one he had inflicted right here in the clinic. The lie, the cowardly, shameful omission of truth, because he couldn't bear to admit his failure. He had looked Dr. Sharma in the eye and lied, sending her on a diagnostic path that led them all to that green room, to that pink syringe. He had almost murdered his partner. The fall had caused the injury, but the lie had signed the death warrant. It was only Kaiser himself, with his last ounce of life, his last warrior's growl, who had saved them both. At 2:00 a.m., the surgical door opened. Cade shot to his feet. It was Jenna. Her face was streaked with sweat, her mask down. She didn't look at him. She went to a supply cabinet, grabbed 2 more bags of plasma, and ran back into the OR. The door swung shut. He sank back into the chair. His hope, which had flared for a second, died. They needed more plasma. The bleeding wasn't stopping. He put his head in his hands, his bloody palms pressing against his temples. At 3:15 a.m., the door opened again. This time, it was Dr. Sharma. She was not running. She was walking slowly, her body slumped with an exhaustion so profound it looked like a physical weight. She pulled her surgical mask down, and it hung around her neck. Her face was pale, her hair matted with sweat, her green scrub spattered with a dark, wet red that was not hers. Cade's heart stopped. He couldn't breathe. This was it. This was the walk of a doctor who had lost the battle. Dr. Sharma stopped in front of him. She stared at him for a long, silent moment, and then she smiled. It was not a big smile, it was a small, exhausted, utterly beautiful crack in her professional mask. "He's a fighter," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I'll give him that. He's the stubbornest soldier I've ever had on my table." Cade couldn't speak. He just stared, his mind unable to process the words. "The surgery was a success," she said, finally letting herself sag against the wall. "The fall ruptured his spleen, just as we thought. It was a mess, Cade. He lost a tremendous amount of blood, but we got it. The spleen is out. We've transfused him. His vitals are stabilizing." She looked at him, her eyes clear and serious. "He's not out of the woods. Not by a long shot. The next 12 hours are critical, but he's alive. He's in recovery." Cade's legs gave out. He didn't fall. He just sank back into the chair, the relief so sudden and so total it was like a physical blow. A sound, a raw, strangled sob, escaped his chest. He buried his face in his hands, not caring that he was smearing his own face with his dog's drying blood. Dr. Sharma sat down in the chair next to him. "That growl," she said, "to the room, to the air. In that room, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it." He was seconds away. Seconds. She turned and looked at him. His loyalty, that reflex, it saved his life. And it saved you, too, Cade. From a mistake we both would have carried forever. Cade did not move when the sun came up. He watched the harsh fluorescent lights of the waiting room pale in the blue, uncertain light of dawn. He was still sitting in the chair Dr. Sharma had left him in, his body rigid, his hands still covered in the dark, flaking crust of Kaiser's blood. He had not washed them. He felt he had no right. The clinic slowly came to life. He heard the front door unlock, the sound of a computer booting up. Jenna, the young tech, returned, her face scrubbed clean, wearing fresh scrubs. She saw Cade, a ghost in the morning light, and her expression softened with pity. A few minutes later, Dr. Sharma emerged from the back. She, too, had changed. She wore a fresh blue polo and khaki pants, but her eyes were red-rimmed, her exhaustion profound. She was holding 2 cups of coffee. She slid one across the desk toward Cade. "He's stable," she said, her voice low. "He made it through the night. His vitals are holding." Cade just looked at the coffee. "He's awake," she said, understanding what he couldn't ask. "He's weak, and he's confused. But he's awake. You can see him." 5 minutes. Cade stood, his legs stiff, his back screaming in protest. He felt 100 years old. He followed her past the surgical suite, which was now dark, and into a small recovery area. It was an intensive care unit, a row of sterile kennels. Kaiser was not in a kennel. He was on a thick, soft bed on the floor, surrounded by a fortress of heating blankets and 4 poles. He was a tapestry of medical intervention. His entire abdomen was shaved, revealing a long, dark line of angry black stitches. A plastic cone, the cone of shame, encircled his neck. Tubes ran from his leg to a bag of fluids, and a monitor next to him beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm. He looked broken, but he was breathing. "Kaiser," Cade whispered. The name felt foreign, heavy on his tongue. The dog's ears, the only part of him that seemed to work, twitched. His head was too heavy to lift. He was groggy from the anesthesia and the blood loss. But he turned his head just slightly on the pillow. His eyes, cloudy with medication, found Cade's, and then his tail gave a single, weak thump against the bedding. Cade's composure, the ironclad discipline of a lifetime, shattered. He didn't just kneel. He collapsed to his knees beside the bed. He reached out a trembling hand, still stained, and laid it on the dog's head. Kaiser leaned into the touch, just a fraction of an inch, and let out a long, sighing groan. Cade buried his face in the fur of his dog's neck, just below the hard plastic cone, and wept. He did not make a sound. It was a silent, shuddering collapse, a release of the guilt, the fear, and the profound, agonizing gratitude. He had been given a reprieve. Kaiser was alive. Dr. Sharma watched from the doorway for a moment, then quietly walked away. 3 days later, Cade was signing the most expensive piece of paper he had ever seen. The bill for the emergency surgery, the plasma transfusions, and the intensive care was staggering. He paid it without blinking. "He's a miracle," Dr. Sharma said, handing him a large bag of medications and a list of instructions. "He's weak, Cade. The surgery was a success, but the trauma, his body has been through a war. No stairs, no running, no anything but rest. The definition of gentle, Cade. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. There was no arrogance left, No restlessness, only humility. "You're a good caregiver, Cade," she said, her voice softening. "He's lucky he had you here." The words almost broke him again. He, the man who had caused it all, was being called a good caregiver. He just nodded, unable to speak. The drive home was the slowest Cade had ever taken. Kaiser sat in the passenger seat, thin and frail, his stitches hidden by a soft recovery suit. He was still wearing the cone, which he clearly despised, but his eyes were bright. He was watching the town of Red Rock Creek go by, sniffing the air that came through the slightly cracked window. For the next week, Cade's life found a new rhythm. His leave was no longer a restless purgatory. It was a mission. But it was a different kind of mission. It was not about force. It was about patience. His focus was not on pushing limits, but on respecting them. The seal who had needed to conquer a quarry ledge was gone. In his place was a man who woke up every 2 hours to let his dog outside, gently carrying him down the porch steps, a man who learned to crush pills and hide them in small bites of chicken, who spoke in a low, constant murmur of encouragement. He learned that true strength wasn't about the absence of weakness. He learned that strength was about showing up, about supporting, about the quiet, unglamorous work of healing. One night, about a week after they had returned, the first real snow of the season began to fall outside. The farmhouse was warm, the fireplace casting a flickering orange glow. Kaiser, finally free of his cone, was sleeping on his thick bed by the fire. His long, zippered incision was healing, no longer angry, just a scar. Cade sat on the floor next to him, not reading, just watching the flames. Kaiser stirred, letting out a low whine. His arthritis, which had been the original, simple problem, was bothering his good hip in the cold. Cade, who had once viewed that stiffness as a weakness to be challenged, now saw it only as a pain to be soothed. "I know, buddy," he murmured. He moved, sitting behind the dog, and began to gently massage the old, tired muscles of Kaiser's good hip. He worked his fingers in slow, careful circles, his touch firm but gentle, channeling warmth into the joint. He was no longer a commander. He was a caregiver. Kaiser, who had been tense, let out a deep, shuddering groan, not of pain, but of pure, absolute contentment. He melted into the touch, his body relaxing completely. Then he did something he hadn't done since the hospital. With a small effort, he shifted his body. He turned his head and, with a sigh, laid his heavy, gray-muzzled head directly onto Cade's lap. Cade's hands froze. He stared at the dog, who was now looking up at him. Kaiser's eyes were not confused, not in pain, not angry. They were just his. They were the eyes of his partner. It was a gesture of complete trust. It was an offer of forgiveness. Cade felt the last cold knot of his guilt finally unravel. He slowly, gently stopped the massage. He leaned forward, bending his own head down until his forehead came to rest on the top of Kaiser's. It was the same gesture of partnership he had shared on frozen mountaintops and in dusty, dangerous compounds. "You saved me, Kaiser," Cade whispered, his voice thick, his eyes closed. "You saved me." Kaiser just sighed again, a warm puff of air against Cade's chest. In the quiet farmhouse, in the warm glow of the fire, the snow falling like a blanket outside, the forgiveness was given and received without a single word.